right, welcome everyone to Liz's defense. It's a big and exciting day. With much excitement am I here introducing her, but I think I have a smidgen of empty nest syndrome also, so it's a bittersweet thing for me. All right, I'd like to introduce Liz Brookshire Madden. She got her Bachelor of Science degree at Vanderbilt University in human and organizational development with a minor in child development. She got her master's at Vanderbilt University in speech-language pathology. Liz did her clinical fellowship at the VA Tennessee Valley Healthcare System, go VA. And she came to the Aphasia lab in 2010 to work as a research speech-language pathologist on one of our clinical trials. She worked with us for a year and then very, very thankfully joined the DOC program in 2011. Liz has been very productive and hopefully had a lot of fun along the way in the Aphasia lab. She's had 13 poster presentations, 2 platform presentations. She's co-authored 2 book chapters. She has 6 publications, and she was awarded the Asha Foundation New Sensory Doctoral Scholarship in 2015. She's already accepted her tenure track position at Florida State University. Congratulations. And I'm sure her parents are very happy to have her back in Florida. All right, well, without further ado, Liz will talk to us about her dissertation. It's entitled The Relationship Between Non-Orthographic Language Abilities and Reading Performance, an Exploration of the Primary Systems Hypothesis.
Thank you, Diane. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with all of you about my research. And as Diane mentioned, for my dissertation, I looked at the relationship between non-orthographic language abilities and reading performance in individuals who had a stroke and present with aphasia. I wanted to quickly mention that non-orthographic means that all of the language measures did not contain letters. There was no orthography. I'll talk about this in more detail later, but I wanted to briefly mention it now in case some of you are curious about that word. I'm going to start by showing us a fun video to get us thinking about the process of reading. Then I will define aphasia and alexia. These were the communication disorders of interest in my study. Then I'll talk a little bit about the clinical and theoretical motivations behind my work before I describe the research aims, the method, the results, and discussion of the findings. And then we'll have some time for questions. So reading is something that we do every day, and we probably aren't thinking about the complex brain processing that's going on. Our brain has to very quickly figure out the neural connections between letters and the corresponding sounds and meaning to help us make sense of written language. So I'm going to show a video that demonstrates that reading can be tricky at times. And as you watch this video, I want you thinking about how quickly you're able to make connections between letters, sounds, and their meaning.
Bomb, B-O-M-B, bomb. What rhymes with bomb? Tom. So we add a T, T-O-M-B. That's not Tom, that's tomb. And if we add a C, it doesn't rhyme with tomb, it's comb. C-O-M-B, comb. What rhymes with comb? Home, so we add an H. H-O-M, that's not home. If we want home, we have to add an E. And if we add an S, doesn't rhyme with home, that's some. What rhymes with some? Numb. So we add an N, N-O-M-E, numb. No, that's not numb. If we want a numb, we have to add a U. That's not enough. Got to add a B also, N-U-M-B. And if you think that's crazy, just remember that English spelling from A to Z is D-U-M-B.
So I'm glad you guys enjoyed that video, and Ed was just demonstrating that English has what is called a deep orthography. This means that the connections between graphemes and phonemes, or the connections between letters and sounds, it's not always one-to-one. It can be inconsistent at times. And as many of you may know or can easily imagine, this can make it very difficult when children are trying to learn to read, and it can also be very difficult for adults who are trying to learn to read again after they've had a stroke. And that's where my research is focused. I'm interested in better understanding the process of reading, and in particular, I want to understand how we can rehabilitate reading after neurological impairment, especially in individuals who have aphasia and alexia. So I'm going to be testing your letter sound knowledge throughout the talk to keep you on your toes, but now I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about aphasia and alexia. Aphasia is an acquired language processing disorder. Aphasia can differentially impair someone's language production and language comprehension abilities. It's most often the result of left hemisphere brain injury, most typically from a stroke, with 25 to 40% of individuals who have a stroke acquiring aphasia, and there are approximately 1 million Americans currently living with aphasia, according to the National Aphasia Association. Alexia is another common acquired communication disorder. This is a specific reading disorder that again occurs after brain injury. Alexias are generally thought to belong to two broad categories, the first being a peripheral alexia. And this type of reading disorder impairs your ability to visually perceive and analyze the letters. Another type of alexia are referred to as central alexias. And with this type of reading disorder, you can discriminate the letters, but you're unable to derive the sounds or meanings associated with the letters. And that's where this talk is focused, on central alexias. It's these types of reading disorders that commonly occur after left hemisphere injury and are associated with aphasia. For one of my pre-dissertation projects, I looked at the frequency of alexia in chronic aphasia, and we found that 67 out of 99 individuals with aphasia met the criteria for a central alexia. And this is in line with the literature that routinely demonstrates that the majority of individuals with aphasia will also have a co-occurring alexia. I want to briefly mention that almost all individuals with aphasia will report some changes in their reading ability, but not everyone will meet the specific alexia criteria. So before I describe these specific criteria and the different subtypes of alexia, I'm going to have us all take a quick reading test. And this reading test will help us understand how central alexias are commonly diagnosed. So you're going to see one word at a time on the screen, and I'd like you all to read it out loud. Are we ready?
Sheet, president, suit, laugh, fight, fine, piff, loosh.
All right, nice job. So I thought there was another word. I was just waiting for you guys to keep reading. So you may have noticed I was showing different types of words. Some of those words are what we call regular, meaning that the correspondence between the letters and sounds is what you would typically expect. A few of those words were irregular, and some of those letter to sound correspondences were a little unusual. There were also words called pseudo-homophones. These words, the orthography is unfamiliar. That letter string you probably haven't seen, but you're able to still derive the phonology and semantics. And finally, there were non-words that have unfamiliar orthography and unfamiliar phonology, and there's no meaning attached to these words. So it's reading aloud of these types of words that are often used to classify somebody into an alexia subtype. And there are three main subtypes that I'm going to describe. And again, this diagnosis is based off of how well somebody can read aloud words and also what types of errors they make when they're reading. For a surface alexia, the hallmark error that you look for is somebody who really has trouble with those irregular words, but they do fairly well when presented with a regular word. This is called a regularity effect. And what you'll commonly see is when someone has surface dyslexia, when they try to read an irregular word, they try to sound it out. So they might say pint instead of pint. Conversely, phonological alexia, these individuals have difficulty reading non-words, but they do fairly well with familiar real words. And this is because they're unable to make those connections between letters and sounds, so they try to just rely on whole word recognition. So what happens when they come across words they don't recognize? If they're shown a non-word, such as flig, they'll typically just turn it into a real word that kind of looks similar, like fig, even if they're told this is not a real word. And there are also real words, if they're not able to just recognize it, they will again kind of turn it into a familiar word that looks similar or sounds similar, such as saying single for signal, perhaps. And deep alexia is considered to be a more severe form of phonological alexia. So again, we see this lexicality effect where real word reading is superior to non-words, but both the real words and the non-words are impaired, particularly non-word reading. And the defining feature of this type of alexia is someone who makes a semantic reading error. So perhaps they see the written word boot, but they say shoe. So my interest in studying alexia in aphasia has both clinical and theoretical motivations. First, I'll talk to you about my experiences that motivate this from a clinical perspective. As Diane mentioned, before I joined the PhD program, I was able to work as a research speech pathologist in her lab. And during that time is when I realized I was really passionate and interested in learning about acquired reading disorders and specifically working on reading treatments. Almost all of the participants I worked with in the lab during phonomotor therapy would tell me that their reading difficulties significantly interfere with their daily life activities, and several even mentioned that one of the main reasons they were unable to return to work after their stroke was due to their written language impairment. They couldn't read well enough to return to work. So I'm going to show a quick video and just let you hear from some of the participants in my study as they're telling us about what reading is like since their stroke.
I have a difficult time reading things and trying to put things together in a sentence. And that's been kind of frustrating for me because I'm used to communicating with people.
I don't understand, and I do it again, and still I don't quite get what they're talking about. So sometimes it doesn't work for me.
So reading goes, when I was normal, I was able to get information done and quickly and so forth. Today, when I'm reading things, if I am loud, saying myself, I'm out loud, then I find that it's really difficult. I will lose, I will not be able to continue with a sentence. I'll stuck with a word and just be unable to do it.
If I could read, I would have a job and I would be able to have a different life.
Well, they pretty much is non-existence anymore because there's reading and writing it's kind of out of the picture now. I'm
nothing except you for you. Nothing like you.
It's terrible. I like it, but I can't feel some of the stuff, so I have to look at it a lot. I do it, and then I look at it, and I have to do it a little bit more.
Okay. So these research participants and other individuals with aphasia that I've worked with in the clinic motivate me to conduct aphasia research. Specifically, they motivate me to want to study acquired reading impairment with the hope, I think, I think so. I know the balance of the what. Ooh, how are we doing? Okay, okay. So what I was mentioning is that it's from my clinical experience working with individuals with aphasia that really motivate me to study acquired reading impairments with the intention and hope that my research findings can one day contribute to clinical practice. But in addition to my personal clinical motivation, this study has a theoretical motivation. So traditionally in the aphasia literature, spoken language and written language are assumed to rely on distinct linguistic representations and processing mechanisms. However, more recently, this traditional view has been challenged, and there's a debate concerning the extent to which our written language abilities may rely on the same neural mechanisms that allow us to participate in spoken language production and comprehension. An alternative view says that indeed there are some shared mechanisms, specifically that there are primary semantic, phonologic, and visual systems that contribute and underlie all of our language abilities. This is called the primary systems hypothesis. This hypothesis proposes that our abilities to read and spell, our written language abilities, developed from and rely on the pre-existing neural systems that were already in place that we were using for spoken language before we, as humans, began to engage in written language. So therefore, from this viewpoint, an Alexia is not truly a specific reading disorder as traditionally thought, but instead the primary systems hypothesis proposes that an Alexia is really just a reflection of underlying general language impairment if you look deep enough. And the primary systems hypothesis is based off of assumptions of a parallel distributed processing model. And according to this model, word knowledge exists as a learned pattern of neural activation that involves simultaneous activation and integration of distributed semantic, phonologic, and orthographic representations. Now, when this computational model is being trained, first connections between semantics and phonology are learned by the computer, and then orthographic representations are mapped on to those other language skills. This is similar to how a child first learns connections between the sounds in their language and the meaning. They first learn how semantics and phonology go together, then they're able to map on letters to the sounds and words they're already familiar with. So when the computational model is fully intact, this is representing a literate adult who's able to read and write. So this model proposes that there's input from all of these language domains for any language processing task. However, it's hypothesized that there is going to be a different degree of input from these language representations depending on what language activity you may be participating in. So for example, if we were engaging in a word repetition task, I say table, you say table, this model would propose that the activation going on is primarily being influenced by connections between semantics and phonology. If we were to engage in an oral reading task and I asked you to read again some regular words or non-words, the model would propose that our ability to read aloud these types of words is primarily supported by connections between phonology and orthography that allow us to sound out these words. But if we're reading an irregular word such as chef, again, we're having contribution from the entire interconnected system, but more input is coming from semantics to orthography. Semantics provide this extra boost that help us to read these irregular words that are much harder for us to process if we were just relying on trying to sound them out. So there's previous findings in the literature that support the primary systems hypothesis. And specifically, spoken language abilities, your non-orthographic semantic and phonologic performance has been shown to be significantly related to oral reading performance in individuals who have a semantic dementia, primary progressive aphasia, as well as chronic aphasia. So the aim of this current study was to replicate and extend the previous work and to further test out these assumptions of the primary systems hypothesis. In this study, I examined how non-orthographic language abilities are related to reading abilities in individuals with chronic aphasia. Specifically, I wanted to see how semantic, phonologic, and syntactic abilities were related to the ability to read aloud single words, and that has been done previously in other studies. I also wanted to look at the relationship with reading comprehension beyond just single words, looking at comprehension of written sentences and paragraphs. Typically in the aphasia literature, reading is commonly treated and assessed only at the single word level of reading aloud, and comprehension beyond the single word is less often explored. And finally, I wanted to see if someone's non-orthographic language performance was related to what type of alexia and the severity of that alexia they may have. So now I'll talk you through the methods that I used to address these aims. All the participants in this study were recruited from the University of Washington Aphasia Registry and Repository Database. 47 participants were enrolled and 43 met our study criteria, which involved having aphasia as a result of left hemisphere stroke. You had to be at least 6 months post your stroke to enter into that chronic phase. You had to pass vision and hearing screenings, have at least a high school education. English was everyone's primary language. There were no other neurological diagnoses such as Parkinson's disease or dementia, and there were no severe apraxia or severe dysarthria. The average age of these participants was 62, and they were about 69 months, or an average about 5.5 years had passed since they had their stroke, and average education was 15 years. I worked with each participant for 4 to 9 hours depending on their language abilities, and we worked for 2 to 3 sessions. During our first session together, we completed a descriptive test battery. This allowed me to determine if they were eligible to participate and also described their speech, language, and cognitive abilities. I'm not going to go into depth about these tests, but I'd be happy to answer questions if you're interested. I'm going to focus on the experimental test battery that was completed during the second and third testing sessions. During this time, 23 language and reading tests were administered, and for each participant, these tests were administered in random order within and across the different language domains. This table lists the 11 language tests that were all derived from standardized test batteries. They were each assessing a different language domain, in particular semantics, phonology, and syntax. And again, I want to mention that all of these tests were non-orthographic, meaning there were no letters. These were all language comprehension tasks. There was no reading or writing involved. And these specific subtests were selectively chosen to help me test out the model. So to assess semantic representations and processing, 4 semantic subtests were administered: picture association, spoken word to picture matching, auditory synonym judgment, as well as comprehension of verbs and adjectives. I'm going to highlight and give you an example of just one task. Participants saw 5 different pictures, and they were asked to focus on the picture on top and then point to which picture on the bottom would correspond closest in meaning. So here they would point to the grapes. They don't have to say anything, they just have to point to the picture. To assess phonologic representations and processing, there were 4 different subtests administered that looked at minimal pair judgment, real word and non-word judgment, as well as a phoneme manipulation task that I will describe. So participants were given some colored wooden blocks, and they were told to show me the number of blocks that matched the number of sounds that I would say. And I would say a non-word sequence. I might say, show me ip, and the correct response would be 2 blocks, ip. They didn't have to say that, they just had to show the 2 blocks. Then I would say, okay, if that's ip, show me thip. And the correct response would be adding a 3rd block to show me that they recognize there are 3 sounds and the non-word FIP. So syntax is not represented on this model. This model is typically focused on single word processing. But if we had to try to map it on, we would say that our syntactic skills kind of are derived from or rely upon our semantic and phonologic processing. And there were 3 different subtests that looked at this skill. I'm going to highlight one. It was called comprehension of locative phrases. Participants saw 4 different similar pictures and would hear me say squares and circles, and then they would need to find the correct picture. There was also a battery of reading tests. Some of these tests were looking at ability to read aloud single words, while other tests were focused on reading comprehension. And again, these subtests were carefully chosen to assess orthographic representations and processing. So we did that through oral reading, similar to the test you took earlier, although they read like 115 words. They saw regular words, irregular, pseudo-homophone, and non-words as well. And in addition, another way to look at orthographic processing skills is through reading comprehension. There were several tests at the single word, sentence, and paragraph level. Quick example would be silently to themselves, participants would read this paragraph and then point to the corresponding picture. So after all this testing was completed and all the data was collected, it was time to process and manage our large amount of data. And in particular, I want to talk about how we calculated composite scores and how we determined a reading profile for each participant. So we had 24 tests that all had different scoring system. You might have 10 out of 20 on this test and 50 out of 60 on this test. So to allow for a standard comparison, all of the raw test scores were converted into a z-score. And a z-score tells us how well the participant was performing relative to everyone else in the sample. So specifically, a z-score lets us know how many standard deviations away from the group average they were performing. So the next step was then to average z-scores for each participant to create a composite score. So one person may have 4 semantic z-scores. Those were averaged to give them their overall semantic composite. Then I could average everyone's composites to make an overall group composite for each language domain. And this was for use in the regression analysis that I will get to shortly. I also worked on assigning a reading profile to each participant, whether they met an Alexia subtype criteria or perhaps they read within normal limits. And to do this, we did an extra analysis of just the oral reading data, and we looked at how accurate they were and the types of errors they made. In terms of their accuracy, instead of just saying they performed with 80% accuracy, a range of their ability was created. So for each word type, there was an accuracy range. And this range is a 95% confidence interval that was created for each word type. And this allowed us then to compare how someone did, say, on real words versus non-words. We could compare those ranges, and if there was an overlap in the ranges, we would say, well, there's probably not a difference. That range lets us know that if they were tested several times, where their true ability may fall. So we were able to compare the confidence intervals to get an idea of which words they could read aloud well compared to others. To further help us figure out reading profiles, we analyzed oral reading errors. So wonderful research assistants went through and looked at video recordings, and they transcribed every oral reading response in IPA, and if an error occurred, they assigned it a specific error code, and these error types reflect the hallmark Alexia symptoms that we know exist. So an error may be coded as visual phonologic if it was related in sound or meaning, perhaps semantic if they said boat for yacht. If they turned a non-word into a real word, we called it a lexicalization error. If they overpronounced or overgeneralized letter to sound rules, that was a regularization error. Oftentimes participants would say a real word, but it wasn't related in sound or meaning to the target word, so that was just considered to be unrelated. And sometimes they would say an unrelated non-word that didn't overlap in letters or sounds as well. And the final category was an omission category if participants were unable to respond. So based on that criteria I explained earlier, we were able to look at their accuracy in reading errors, determine if there were lexicality or regularity effects, and figure out what reading profile each participant fit. So what we saw is that a full range of reading ability existed in this diverse group. Primarily, participants fit the phonological Alexia criteria, with 53% of the sample in that category. 4 individuals met the deep Alexia category, and we had 5 individuals who had what's called global Alexia. I didn't mention this earlier, but this is when an individual has almost no ability at all to read, whether it's a real word or a non-word. These individuals only read between 2 and 4 words out of 115, so they were placed in this global Alexia group. There were a handful of individuals, 5, that did not fit one of our specific criteria. We could not classify these individuals. I'd be happy to talk to you about why I think that may be, if you're curious after. And there were 6 individuals that read within the normal reading limits set by the standardized tests. And I want to briefly mention that nobody met the surface Alexia criteria. And this wasn't that surprising. Surface Alexia is more often seen in a semantic dementia than in chronic aphasia. And I want to quickly highlight that the frequency of Alexia in this sample of aphasia is very similar to my previous study, again showing that the majority of individuals with chronic aphasia will meet an Alexia criteria most often. And we were pretty reliable as our research team at agreeing on if a participant was reading a word accurately and what type of error code to assign. We used a Cohen's kappa. This lets us know how well we were in agreement. A 0 would indicate that our agreement was no better than chance, and a kappa greater than 0.81 lets us know that we had pretty good agreement. What I thought the error should be matched what one of the other researchers thought the error code should be. So after all this data management was completed, we now had the information needed to complete our statistical analysis. So I'm going to talk about each aim one at a time, the analysis and the results that were found. Aim 1, we were looking at oral reading ability. Pearson correlation and multiple linear regression analyses were performed. I'm just going to focus on the regression analysis. So this is a schematic of what was done. Here on the left-hand side, we have the average semantic composite for the group was a predictor, as well as the average phonologic composite. These were entered simultaneously as predictors in the regression models. And there were 5 different models that were looking at oral reading ability. The first model looked at overall oral reading ability of all word types combined. We also looked at just regular words, a model focused on irregular words, pseudo-homophones, and non-words. So the next slide is a big table that has the results from all 5 of these regression models, and I'm going to walk us through that. So to orient you here, this was the outcome of Model 1, overall reading, regular words, irregular words, pseudo-homophones, and non-words. And what we found was, when viewed collectively, semantics and phonology accounted for a significant amount of the variance in all 5 models. But what was interesting was to look at to see, was one predictor contributing more to this outcome than the other. So if we look here on the left side, for overall oral reading, both semantics and phonology were making unique contributions. But when we looked at just regular word reading, only semantics was significantly contributing, and the same for irregular words. When we looked at the influence of semantics and phonology for pseudo-homophone and non-word reading, both semantics and phonology were unique contributors, with phonology having more of an influence. So these models are telling us, as our semantic ability improved, the model would predict that your ability to read regular words and irregular words would also improve. And the bottom models are telling us that if your phonologic performance improved, the model estimates that your ability to read non-words and pseudo-homophones would also improve. So I took these results and made a graphic to maybe make it more clear, and then superimposed it back on our model. So as a reminder, here's our model, And the next slide, all I've done is taken orthography, shifted it to the top to make the results easier to see. So let me explain this figure. The size of each box and the width represents the size and strength of the relationship. 1 asterisk indicates that there was a significant correlation between phonology and oral reading, or between semantics and oral reading. And 2 asterisks indicate that not only was the correlation significant, but that the language ability was significantly predictive of oral reading. So when we think back to that interconnected distributed model, in this sample of aphasia, it appears that the connections between phonology and orthography are primarily contributing to their ability to read pseudo-homophones and non-words, whereas connections between the meanings in the letters are primarily contributing to their ability to read irregular and regular words. So if we look at the takeaway message from AIM 1, these findings suggest that your non-orthographic language performance is predictive of how well you may read. Specifically, well, as I mentioned, this is in support of the hypothesis, and we saw that depending on what your orthographic stimulus may be, whether you're trying to read a regular word, an irregular word, or a non-word, we expect that there may be different degrees of input within the model. And it appeared that this group of individuals with aphasia was primarily relying on semantic knowledge. They were primarily relying on being able to see a word and extract the meaning, and they were not as able to sound out. They weren't really relying on letter to sound knowledge to read, more so in whole word reading. For AIM 2, now the outcome was reading comprehension. Again, there were correlation and regression analyses, but I'm going to talk to you just about the regression analysis. So we had our same semantic and phonologic predictors, but now that we were looking at reading beyond the single word level, we added in syntax as a third predictor. And there were 4 models. The first model looked at overall reading comprehension across all linguistic levels. The second model just focused on your ability to comprehend written single words. And we looked at being able to read at the sentence level and understanding written paragraphs. So here's the table that has results from all 5 models. And again, collectively, the models, semantics, phonology, and syntax were accounting for a significant amount of the variance at all of these different reading levels. But if we want to look and see, well, which ability may be contributing more, we found that for overall comprehension, really the model was predicting that as your semantics improved, that was really what was estimating a change in your reading comprehension. This was also seen at the single word level. So those individuals, if your semantic abilities improved, this model would estimate that your reading comprehension should also improve. But at the sentence level, we found that both semantics, or that all 3, semantics, phonology, and syntax, were all unique contributors. So if any of these different language abilities improved, we would expect to see that your ability to comprehend written sentences would also improve. And finally, reading at the paragraph level, only semantics was a unique predictor. And this may be because the individuals with aphasia were just targeting in on key words and really recognizing on whole word recognition and weren't really reading through the entire paragraph. Again, I turned these results into a graphic and superimposed them on the model to try to figure out, how PDP and primary systems would talk about these findings. So what we would see here is that the connections between phonology and orthography, kind of sounding out all the letters and decoding the words, that's not really having as strong as a contribution as connections between semantics and orthography and syntax and orthography. Specifically, your ability to relate, connect the meaning to the letters was what was primarily influencing reading comprehension at this group. At the single word level and paragraph level. When reading sentences, there was some input from all 3 domains, but again, primarily from semantics and syntax, with phonology playing a lesser role in reading comprehension. And this isn't that surprising. We know many individuals with aphasia may understand a written word that they're not able to decode or read aloud. So it makes sense that phonology may be playing a lesser role for individuals who have difficulty with phonology. So the results of AIM-2 suggest that your non-orthographic language performance is informative of how well you're going to be able to perform in reading comprehension tasks. And this also suggests that the primary system's assumptions don't apply just to reading aloud single words. We saw that your ability to understand spoken words and spoken sentences for individuals with aphasia, these abilities should be related to how well they can understand written words and written sentences. And again, we saw that depending on what the stimulus is, whether you're trying to understand a written word versus a sentence versus a paragraph, different language domains may be contributing more to that ability. And again, it seems that individuals with aphasia are really relying on connections between the meaning in the letters, between semantics and orthography. The third aim, I wanted to see how individuals their reading profile, was there any relation to what type of lexia they had to how well they performed on the semantic and phonologic measures. As I briefly mentioned before, the primary systems hypothesis has really specific predictions. They say that each type of central lexia, there should be a co-occurring language impairment below. So this is not based off of real data. This is from Crisp and Lamb and Ralph, who are saying this is how they think the alexias should present. So someone who is a normal reader should have no semantic or phonologic impairment. They propose that someone who is on the phonological deep continuum should have impaired phonology and decent semantics. If you have global alexia, these researchers propose that you should have very poor semantic and phonologic performance. And we did not see this type of alexia, but surface alexia, these individuals should have poor semantic ability and decent phonologic ability. So I took our data and tried to kind of make our figure to match this. And of course, when you have real data, they don't all separate into pretty boxes or pretty corners. Let me orient you to this figure. So down here in the x-axis, we have their performance on phonology, and the y-axis is showing their semantic performance. And each of these data points represents an individual participant. So there are 43 participants up here, and they're color-coded based on what type of reading profile they fit into. So this is all shown in z-scores. So again, a 0 means that that individual was performing on average out of those 43 folks. Individuals who are on the positive side, on average, they were performing above average compared to the rest of the group. And if you have a negative z-score, you are performing below average compared to everyone else with aphasia. So even there's a lot of overlap between the profiles, we can see that the individuals with global alexia in the purple and deep alexia in the green, they were all below average on their semantic and phonologic performance compared to the other individuals with aphasia. And although there was a lot of variability, when I averaged everyone with phonological alexia, they tended to be right about average compared to the rest of the group. And those who fell within normal reading limits were about half a standard deviation above the rest of the group. So I wanted to look and see were these differences statistically significant. This was just kind of a visual idea before running more tests. So here we have those who met within normal limits, and as we work our way down, the reading impairment gets more severe. Within normal limits, phonological, deep, and global. The blue bar is showing us semantic ability, and the pinkish, what's supposed to be pinkish bar is showing phonology. And what we found is individuals who were reading within normal limits had statistically significant better semantics and phonology than the global group or the deep group. And individuals with phonological alexia had statistically significant better semantics and phonology than those with global alexia. When I looked within the groups, those who had phonological and deep alexia, their semantic abilities were significantly better. They were better than their phonology skills. So the results of AIM-3 are suggesting that Alexia severity may reflect more than just your reading ability, that it actually reflects that you may have some underlying general language impairment. Specifically that if you know somebody's semantic and phonologic abilities, this might give you a hint at what type of reader they're going to be. And if you look closer and look at the discrepancy between semantics and phonology, you may have an idea of where in that continuum. If you see a big difference, your client is much better at semantics than phonology, they're probably going to fit the phonological deep profile. If they have fairly good semantics and phonology, they may read within normal limits. And if they have very poor semantics and phonology, they're probably going to be more in line with that global Alexia criteria. So these findings endorse the primary systems hypothesis and let us suggest that perhaps Alexia really isn't just a reading problem, and if you dig deep enough, it's really reflecting underlying central language impairment. So to tie these results together, all three aims, the results from all three questions, provide promising support for this primary systems hypothesis. We saw that non-orthographic language abilities were significantly related to oral reading, reading comprehension, and type and severity of Alexia in this diverse group of individuals with aphasia. So this suggests that perhaps there is some relationship between our spoken and written language skills. If we go back to this controversy, these results are suggesting that yes, there probably are some shared mechanisms. There are more than just these, but at least we think that there are these primary systems that are going to support all of our language abilities. So in addition to perhaps contributing to reading theory, these results have clinical implications as well. The main takeaway is that in clinic, perhaps we should start assessing and treating language abilities or spoken skills when we really want to help someone work on their reading. We can't get away from, this letter goes with this sound, but this study suggests first in diagnostics, you may already have an idea of what type of reader they are based on their semantics and phonology, and then in your treatment you also want to work on spoken skills as well, as the regression model suggests that improvement in their spoken abilities is also going to help improve their reading abilities. I want to mention some limitations, as all studies have. The participants only had a left hemisphere stroke, so these findings are limited to this group. It'd be interesting to look at aphasia and Alexia due to other etiologies. The language measures were all receptive and nonverbal. They were all looking at ability to understand spoken language. So these findings, we do not know how expressive tasks, as people were producing complex sentences or naming pictures, how that is related to reading. And when we look at the reading measures, for oral reading, it was pretty narrowly defined. We only looked at the effect of type of word, real versus non-word. We could also look at other linguistic variables that are known to influence reading, such as frequency or imageability, and how those variables may interact with semantics or phonology. And for the reading comprehension subtest, overall they were pretty simplistic. Many participants would say, well, I can read this, but I can't read my book at home. So in future studies, it may be worthwhile to have more functional reading comprehension passages that are more taxing, and then we might be able to see more relationships beyond just semantics. So for future directions, I plan to continue to study what I think is this interesting relationship between spoken and written language abilities. I'd like to extend beyond just reading and also look at spelling skills to get the full assessment of written language. And I would like to look at other predictors. There's more to reading than just semantics, phonology, and syntax. We need to look at other cognitive abilities, such as the effect of attention or working memory and how this influences reading and writing abilities. And again, my motivation is really coming from wanting to take these findings back to the clinic and try to find helpful ways to assess and treat reading impairment, with my ultimate career goal of developing and validating a treatment protocol that helps with reading rehabilitation. So thank you for being here. I'd like to acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Diane Kendall. Thank you so much. And my committee members, Dr. Christy Spencer and Dr. Kathy Yorkston, and Dr. Tim Conway and Dr. Maya Henry, who have been with us through Google Hangouts this whole time. Thank you so much. Everyone in the Aphasia Lab, my wonderful colleagues, my amazing research assistants that helped me go through a lot of data. Could not have done this without you. Thank you to this department for supporting me through teaching assistantships and on the training grant. And thank you to Ernie and Craig for all of their support. And finally, thank you to my family, my husband and parents for all of their continued support and encouragement. Are there any questions? Katie.
Why limit your sample size to left hemisphere strokes?
Great question. Oh, she wanted to know why only limit the sample to left hemisphere stroke. And this is just kind of traditionally how aphasia research is done, trying to have, there's going to be a lot of variability when we're looking at brain injury, but trying to keep some control over our sample. And also that most often aphasia is going to result from left hemisphere stroke. So it's more rare for someone to have an aphasia after a right hemisphere stroke, unless perhaps they're left-handed. So really that's where most of the participants, their injury is going to be. Lauren?
First off, wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And just awesome.
Thank you.
And what a great study. So big.
Thanks, Lauren.
So I'm going to bite on your 5 participants that you couldn't classify.
Oh, yes.
As well.
Who are they? Yeah, so, you know, the way Alexia was, she wanted to know about she wanted to know about the 5 individuals that I couldn't classify and what was going on with those guys. So, you know, I was going off traditional Alexia subtypes where you need to have a certain lexicality effect. You know, your real words need to be way better than your non-words. It's kind of arbitrary what is better. So we use those confidence intervals. So there were 3 folks in the study where their real words and non-words, the confidence intervals overlapped a little bit, just barely. So I couldn't say they had that lexicality effect, but then they weren't quite within normal reading limits either. So like they weren't normal, but they weren't poor enough to be in the phonological group. So really I think they have a more mild phonological alexia, and that was a direct result of how I was measuring the lexicality effect. And then the other 2 participants on the other end, they were very poor readers, but they weren't making those semantic errors. So by definition, they didn't fall into a deep alexia category. Although I didn't get to it in this talk, but the results are suggesting that, you know, relying on just one specific type of reading error is not a very good idea. You know, because I'm pretty certain those individuals do have deep alexia, but I couldn't, you know, label them that way because they weren't making semantic errors. And in fact, they had gone through photomotor therapy and had been trained to try to sound everything out. So they weren't making semantic errors because they were really trying to sound out the words, and they also couldn't do that. So they were kind of making unusual errors. Casey.
2 questions from outside the field. So
yeah.
First one, there a recent paper published last week actually. The title says Core Auditory Processing Deficits in Primary Progressive Aphasia. So I'm wondering, in your treatment, you're talking about speaking out, which has sensory motor and auditory processing. Have you thought of having the training on the auditory processing, which you predict a phonological improvement?
Yes.
And the second question,
okay.
Probably
I'm going to forget
totally
that.
Unrelated.
Okay.
Is the presentation the same across languages? So, for
Great
example,
question.
in Spanish, where there's a strong link between the phonology and the orthographic, versus, say, Cantonese and Chinese, where there's none. How does that translate across languages?
Yeah. Both great questions. Let me try the first one. And yes, actually Dr. Kendall's phonomotor therapy, which is a phonologically based treatment, there's a lot of what we would call, auditory verbal tasks, where we're really just trying to work on their auditory discrimination of the different phonemes in isolation and as they occur in non-word sequences and then real word sequences. And it's been shown as individuals' phonology improves, even if it's the connection, the auditory verbal, kind of the auditory perception of a phoneme. I looked at in a different project and 8 individuals who went through that primarily auditory training of phonology, their reading abilities did improve. So I think, we kind of think of a phoneme as being distributed. So most of the time in reading therapy, people just focus on that connection between the letter and the sound, but they don't step to the side and just work on their perception and ability to discriminate the phoneme. And that's where I think we would see better reading ability if they had better auditory perception of the sounds. So yes. Now I forgot the second question. Oh, English. Yeah, different languages. And certainly, so that the surface Alexia type where you have trouble reading those irregular words, I'm going on a limb and saying I don't really think that would exist in languages that have a more shallow orthography. But there still would be reading difficulties and alexias. Again, the idea being that it's truly not just trouble recognizing the letters. If in any language, if you have trouble with the sound structure, you're going to have trouble with reading. But it may play out a little bit different and not fall into these, regular versus irregular. The symptoms may look a little bit different, but again, if there was a spoken language impairment in any language, we would expect that to also have an effect on written language skills too. Mike? I was waiting, Casey. Maybe we'll talk more. He wasn't quite, maybe I didn't go far enough. Okay, Mike.
I just first want to say, great presentation.
Thank you.
I appreciate the topic because oftentimes reading is left on the table with the patient there.
Right.
Especially in acute care and patient rehab when it's really about functional verbal communication.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate the topic. And my question relates to clinicians in the field with all the tests and subtests that you administer.
Yeah.
Knowing that we don't have time to administer all of those,
Right.
Are there a couple that you thought these are really predictive or indicative of some of the problems that we saw?
Yeah.
That we could kind of use just a smattering of those
Right.
to give us more information.
Great question. And yeah, I agree with you. Like I said, most of the participants I work with, they would say, I've come to terms, I've had aphasia now for 5 years. I understand, my speech and my spoken language is better. I've kind of come to terms that I'm always going to have trouble coming up with words, but they're like, I really want to work on my reading and writing, and we just haven't been doing that. So I agree with you that it's kind of the stepchild that isn't really targeted as often. So I wasn't able to address the different correlation analysis, and for that I didn't just look at the composite scores, I looked at each individual subtest. So for example, within the semantic test, the ones that were picture-based, those were not as highly correlated with reading. It was really the test where they had to recognize auditory synonym judgment, or if I would say a sentence, I'd say a word in a definition, and they had to know if it matched. So if I said kicking, hitting something with your hand, those type of tasks were more related to reading, not so much the one I showed where they had to match pictures. That type of task wasn't as informative. And on the phonology side, being able to just know if a word was rhyming wasn't as related, but that manipulation task where they had to really discriminate and know the sounds that I was changing, that task in particular was more related to reading. So it would take more studies and kind of fine-tuning which tests or which type of skills you'd want to target. So I have a little bit of an idea, but still not sure, the quick when you go into their room, what are you going to do? Not picture matching.
All right.
All right.
Thank you very much.